Hello, everyone. I'm Bret Kinsella, founder and CEO of Voicebot.ai. We've been publishing and doing research since 2016. I actually started in the voice industry in 2013. We built some custom assistants around some really interesting use cases back then. But that's actually just the start of it. I was in the 90s, I was helping people come to the web. And 10 years ago, I was working on mobile, and I've seen some other technology transitions in between. But in all that time, I've never been part of an online global conference. And so this is a first for me. I'm really excited. Shout out to Pete Erickson and the entire MoDev team for thinking about this more than a year ago. We could bring people together, we could educate them, we could create community online, and it's more important than ever. So I'm really excited that we'll be part of this together. All right, so I'm going to bring up my presentation. We have lots of charts. A lot of people who know VoiceBot will be familiar with our propensity to really focus on the data. But I didn't want to just stop there. So when Pete said, hey, what could we do, and sort of giving people a perspective on where the state of voice is today, and I said, hey, you know what? I'll come up with charts. And I came up with 11 that I think have some really interesting insights, maybe a little bit different than what you've seen before, but tell you about where we are and where we've come from. And then there's this one framework that I want to walk through that will give you a little bit more insight into where we're headed. Okay, great. So if you're not familiar with Voicebot.ai, you can find us online at Voicebot.ai. And we're really well known for the news. In fact, we had 100,000 users, more than 100,000 users last month. We had several 100,000 page views, biggest month ever. So people are really focused on this. And I'll tell you, like, the website traffic is up, the podcast listenership is up. All these things are happening right now. We look at this as a gauge for interest in the industry. Since we're sort of the most widely used, we've been around the longest, we just sort of see ourselves as a barometer. And so what we try to do is be the central location for all things voice and AI. And for whether it's news or whether it's these in-depth conversations, we want people to be educated, to stay up to date, and we want to give them some insights that they can help use to make better decisions. So that's where we are today with VoiceBot. If you haven't checked that out, please do. Also, check me out on Twitter at Bret Kinsella. I'll try to respond while we're going on today and throughout the conference. Definitely looking to engage with more people from the community. All right, so, and one last thing, VoiceBot Research. We're really known for a lot of this in-depth research. We've been doing this for years now. Voice Industry Pulse report, Smart Speaker Consumer Adoption report recently out, but we've got lots of stuff there. So if you go to research.voicebot.ai, you can find a lot of the data we're talking about today. And we're going to talk about some data that's not from VoiceBot, but we think is really prescient in terms of where we're headed. And so the first part of my conversation today, I want to talk about voice expansion. So that's where we are now. And I think expansion is the operative word about what's happened over the last several years. So first and foremost, when you have a new technology, one of the things I've learned is adoption is key. So you have to look at the adoption numbers. There's a lot of things that look promising early on, but if you don't have adoption, it doesn't really matter. And one of the key barriers to adoption is you need distribution of your technology. That's been one of the key inhibitors for a lot of technologies really taking off. But in voice, that's not been the case. Almost a year and a half ago, Google said, 1 billion devices with Google Assistant available. And around the same time, Apple, 500 million. Baidu, last summer, 400 million. Our estimate is, although Amazon hasn't said it, 200 plus million devices that they have out there. And that doesn't include apps and things like that people might be able to access Alexa through. But we're talking about billions, 2-3 billion people out there that have access to voice assistants today. So distribution is not the problem. The other thing I'll point out here is it's not just about being able then to have access to the technology, it's also, are people using it? And so earlier this year, Google said, hey, 500 million monthly active users of Assistant. A couple years ago, this is actually a little bit older data, 375 million monthly active users on Apple Siri over that time. So we have large numbers who are not only have access to it, but are also actually using this on a regular basis. And that's a sign of a technology that actually has some momentum. All right, so one thing I do want to point out too is I always look about this adoption curve. This was a model developed in the 1950s around agriculture, but it's applied to technology all the time. And I just want to give you a perspective on where we are with voice. So we think about it on the left-hand side of this chart, I've got 4 different devices that have voice. And so people have used voice through smartwatches, smart speakers, cars, and smartphones. And each of those, this shows like how far it is. So this is a normal distribution. Right in the middle is 50% of the US population. And that's what I laid out here because we had some data on that. We say, hey, you know, smartwatches, only a few people are actually using it. It's very early in its adoption cycle. Smartphones, a lot of people are actually using it. We're almost at 50%. And these are monthly active users. So it's not just someone who's tried it. It's people who are actually using it. Smart speakers, as we put out a couple weeks ago, is about a third of the US population. So we're seeing that we're still fairly early in the adoption of voice across these different surfaces. But if you look at the application level, the one that has the most widely adopted is voice search. And that's been around for a while. People are using it. They really like it. And so, you know, we're actually at around 2/3 of US adults are using voice search on a fairly regular basis. So that gives you a perspective about where we are in the adoption of voice as a modality for interacting with digital content and information. The next thing I like to point out is we have these big three surfaces. So if you think about voice, I think you also have to think about how people are accessing it. Smart speakers right at the bottom of this chart, they get most of the action. And our most recent data shows that around 90 million people in the US have access to a smart speaker. That's US adults. So it's about a third of US adults do that today. But about twice as many have actually tried a voice assistant on a smartphone. And about 50% more have tried in the car. So those actually have much wider reach. But then we can look at the next level and we say, hey, monthly and daily active users. And you see, hey, you know, a higher percentage of smart speaker owners are monthly active users, daily active users. And so this gives you a perspective of how this is evolving. But we have these three surfaces. Those are the primary areas. There's a little bit more, which we'll talk about, you know, coming up. But I always want to point people to that data. The next thing I want to point out is that voice assistant use differs by surface. So we have those surfaces on the left, those devices on the left, and then on the top we have these different types of use cases: asking a question, streaming music, you know, weather, you know, and on down the line. And what we try to do is we say, hey, what are the most common and most popular use cases for each of these device surfaces? And what we see there is, we'll start at the top. The smart speaker, number 1, streaming music. Number 2, asking a question. Number 3, asking about the weather. We get to a smartphone, number 1, asking a question, pretty similar, 1 and 2. But then the second one is actually answering a phone call or making a phone call, finding directions, initiating a text message. Very different. Those are 14, 15, and 18 for the smart speaker. And then if you go down to the car, actually it looks a little bit more similar, like making a phone call, number 1, finding directions, number 2, things that we wouldn't be surprised at. But actually asking a question, number 6. So very different in terms of the way that people are using these. And so I just point this out and say, voice isn't one thing. Voice assistants aren't one thing. You have to think about the context. And that's why I always want people, when they're talking about voice, to always think about the user, what surface are they interacting with, and what use case are they focused on. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about, voice speakers have been a catalyst to adoption for voice assistants. And so we had voice assistants. A lot of people, you know, had used Siri or used them in other places, but it was actually the smart speaker that really took off. And if you look at this data from SAR Insight, about 400 million have been sold since smart speakers have been introduced. That's a tremendous amount in just 5 years. So, you know, something that's very different. It introduced voice into people's daily routines, many of them for the very first time, and opened up all these new use cases in the home and these other types of things. So it's been really important for driving voice forward. The next thing I'd like to point out is it's not just about the US and Europe in other countries in Asia, but China in particular has been, over the last several quarters, has been about 30 to 40% of all smart speaker sales. So they've been catching up very quickly in terms of total installed base. And so when we think about voice assistants, we can think about US, Europe, a lot of you know, Japan and Korea and other places in Asia, but then China's got its sort of its own ecosystem. But when you look at it overall, it's a very big part of the smart speaker and voice assistant equation. When we come back to the US, another thing I like to point out is that this year about 90 million people have, US adults have access to smart speakers and are using them. 2 years ago, the growth rate was about 40%. Last year was 32%. Okay, so when we think about growth rate, it's slowing. Now, it's harder to have the same growth rate when you get a bigger base, and so that's sort of natural. But there's some other things that might be going on there, and that's the other thing I want to point out. So definitely a fast growth rate, definitely heading towards that 100 million users in the US, which I think is a nice psychological thing, a third of the population, but we do have that slowing growth rate. And one of the reasons for this might be privacy concerns. So many of you will remember that in 2019, there were all sorts of news stories around all the major voice assistant platforms having information exposed that they were actually listening to recordings of users' interactions with voice assistants. And if you're in the industry, you probably said, oh yes, I know that. That's something that happens, because you need to do that in order to feed the algorithm, make it better, and improve the overall user experience. But one of the problems was a lot of people, regular consumers, didn't know this was going on. And all of a sudden they said, am I comfortable with this? And the fact that they were using third-party contractors and some of this data got out into the public, into the media, made them start to think, hey, this is a problem. And so what we see is in the data last year versus this year, we see the scissor chart, which I have up here. And what you can see is about 46% were either moderately or very concerned at the beginning of January in 2019. About voice assistants and privacy. Well, 23 and 30%, so 53%, that rose between the 2 years. And I think a lot of this has to do with the media coverage and the wider knowledge that consumers have that smart speakers might have some privacy concerns. Now, it hasn't necessarily stopped them from buying smart speakers. In fact, a lot of people that own smart speakers fall in one of those two concern categories. But it is something that could, potentially change the way they interact with the device, turn them off more often, not have them always available. We're not seeing that just yet, but that could happen. The other thing it could do is it could reduce the people who don't have smart speakers and have some interest in doing that. And yes, we're seeing that in the data as well. So from one of our recent surveys here, you can find this at research.voicebot.ai, consumers expecting to become smart speaker owners. We've tracked this the last couple of years. So in 2018 and 2019, somewhere between 9 and 11% of consumers said that they expected to have one either this year or the next year, even though they didn't have a smart speaker at that point. Well, that's dropped by about a third in 2020. So one of the things we started looking at is say, oh, okay, the growth rate, it's already slowing. I actually expect it maybe to slow a little bit further this coming year in terms of new smart speaker adoption, new audience growth, you can think of it that way, because of some of these concerns. So that's something definitely to watch out for. There's still a lot of people in the market. They're still buying smart speakers, still using them on these other surfaces. But there are some indications that maybe we're running out of steam a little bit in this market, and I think privacy is one of the things that we always have to pay attention to. The other thing I point out is there's a lot of great things going on in the industry, a lot of developer commitment, but not everything's rosy right now. And so we took a survey of developers and the voice and AI community. So these come from the US, Europe, Asia, all over the world. And in July of last year, about 13% said they were planning to spend less time in the next 12 months on building out voice apps. These are the voice experiences on Alexa and Google Assistant and Samsung Bixby. They plan to do a little bit less of that. 13% plan to do less, while about 86% plan to do at least the same or more as they'd done in the previous year. 6 months later, the number of the people who plan to do less, commit less resources, less time, doubled to 26%. Now, this isn't all bad news. 74% say they're going to do more, they're going to do a lot in this space, in the voice, but there are a lot of people who are starting to say, hey, I might not want to do this, or I might not want to spend as much time on these platforms. And the question is, why would that be? What's causing this degradation and enthusiasm? And one thing I would point out is that less than half of the people that actually have smart speakers are using third-party apps. Now, this has been fairly consistent over 3 years of data. And I understand that some consumers don't know what's first-party and third-party. First-party being things that the assistant itself provides, like sort of core services that Amazon or Google or Apple provide as part of their assistant. And the third party being everybody else who's like building for that ecosystem. But it's been fairly consistent, and it's eroded just a little bit. And so over 50% of the people say they've not used, this is like not used frequently, they've not used these third-party applications. And as developers are seeing this, they're probably getting frustrated. Now, I call this the third-party voice app gap. We could also say there's a third-party voice app promotion gap, not just adoption gap. But there is this gap here, and that might be reducing some of the enthusiasm that some of the developers have. I will say there are some silver linings to this, though. So first of all, there are more people who are using third-party apps than there were a year ago or 2 years ago. And that's because the market's growing in part. The other thing that's happening is what we see in our data is that people who are using third-party voice apps are using more of them, and they're using them more frequently. So there is this core group of things, of people that are, that are using third-party voice apps a lot in these platforms. But certainly we have this gap of the fact that there's a lot of devices out there and consumers just are not using that. And that's really important. We're going to get to that in just a couple minutes about not just that silver lining, but actually where some of this voice development talent might be headed. Okay, so the next step I'm going to talk about is the evolution, and I'm going to get to our framework in just a minute, but those were our 11 charts, and hopefully you have this sense of, hey, it's growing fast, there's a lot of distribution, it's important to look at the different surfaces and how frequently people are using and what the use cases they have on those surfaces, the importance of smart speakers in developing this market, and a couple of things that I think should be rightfully cause for concern for the industry that are going to need to be addressed over the next couple of years. But how did we get here? And let me just give us some perspective here, and this will lead up to our framework. So the first thing is in 1999, Jaguar S-Type added a voice interface to the car. You could do 44 commands. It was very interesting. It was a new thing in the market, and another feature. And then 2011, most people were first introduced to their first voice assistant, and that was Siri. And so Apple rolled that out. And then in 2014, we had not an existing product, but a new product. A new product debuted, and it debuted to showcase an assistant. So a very different trajectory here. We had additional feature for a car, an additional feature for a smartphone, and then we had a new product because it wanted to be a vehicle for delivering a voice assistant into the home. So if you think about that, in 1999, it was a small little feature. In fact, it was very hard to find anything about this in the Jaguar marketing materials from 1999. They talked about everything about the car and then like, oh, and we have voice control with 44 commands, right? But it was this idea of having something new and different, but it was a small piece of the overall pie. When we get to 2011, Scott Forstall said, Siri is a whole new way of interacting with your iPhone. I mean, it's like transformational. It was the reason to upgrade to the iPhone 4S. So all of a sudden, voice was getting center stage in a very popular consumer product, but still not the only aspect of that product. It's one of many things you're going to be doing on the device. And then in 2014, we had the Echo, a device designed around your voice, and we had this idea that Echo is a tool that helps keep your household functioning. So now we're starting to talk about lifestyle and sort of the broader impact that these devices have. And the centrality of that is just a very different concept as opposed to a feature as the primary function of the capability. So then what we have is we have the car and then the person. It expanded into all these other devices, and at the home it expanded into other devices. And then we said, hey, these are useful at home and in the car. Why aren't they useful in the world? And with COVID, we could see that maybe all these surfaces we're touching all the time, maybe we could voice enable some of them. So there's a lot of things going on where they're saying, hey, some of the benefits of voice that we've seen at the home, we've seen in the car, we should bring those out into the other places that we inhabit. Okay, so let's talk about where we're headed in this voice transition. A couple people have seen me talk about this in the past, and I want to say that I'm going to go a little bit deeper here and have some different concepts. So first of all, we have these general purpose assistants, and they get all the attention. So Alexa, Google Assistant, Bixby, Siri, but they live in this broader context. So, yeah, and I think about this idea of sort of platform controlled and broad and narrow feature set. Like, as a third party, what do you have control over? What can you do? All right. So if I bring this up, I say, okay, so those big players, they're servicing a good part of the world, but not everywhere, obviously. And then another thing that's really interesting is we have this general purpose assistants, and so they're rising, particularly in Asia. Ali Genie from Alibaba, DuerOS from Baidu. You've got Tencent now has a new one, Clovo and Line. And then in Europe, we're seeing this as well. So you've got Yandex in Russia, and you've got Mike in Serbia and Croatia areas. And then you've got Magenta and Jingo, which are kind of like niche assistants, which we'll talk about in a moment, but they also allow you to have Alexa on there, so they also have this general purpose capability. And so they're providing capabilities in other parts of the world, and if you put this all together, you can see a map around the world of different places that voice assistants are servicing. There's some places clearly they haven't made it to yet, but we're getting this broad coverage of both these general purpose global assistants and then some of these regional specialist assistants. Okay, so that gives you that perspective of what we have there, how they're competing, why they're doing this, what their strategy is. There's a Harvard Business Review article that I did. Just go to my Twitter at Bret Kinsella. It's pinned at the top. You can click through. That'll tell you about what the trajectory of all that is. I don't want to go into that here, but that's a whole nother thing. And I say in that upper right-hand corner, they're trying to do a little bit of everything for everyone. But there's other things you could do. So in the upper left, you've got to do a few things for specific users. In the lower left, do a few things for existing customers, or enable others to build their own assistant. So we have this general purpose. They get all the attention. But then we have these other areas, niche, owned, white label. I call this the gown theory, or the gown framework, excuse me. And I think this is the most important trend in voice today, is all these other areas. It's not that Alexa and Google Assistant aren't important. They are. It's a very big market. It's a new market. But in fact, these niche assistants like Aider, which is a small business assistant, which helps you with your back office and all these other types of things. Voicea and Presence AI have both been acquired, so it's sort of have them crossed out. But this whole idea, Cortana is now a niche assistant for Office 365. So that's definitely a thing, just narrower scope, but you don't control that. You can integrate with them. You might be able to do some things, but you don't control it. And then you have in that lower left, you have people who are launching their own assistants. So Snapchat just recently launched something. Spotify's got a solution. We sort of move over to BBC recently to have a better experience with their content. We have banks, we have automakers. Automakers really the first ones to do this. And then in the lower right, you have the white label folks. Houndify, Cerence, Nuance, Microsoft Bot Framework, Mycroft, Allen. What they're allowing you to do is they provide lots of capabilities. You could do a broad assistant, you could do a narrow assistant, but it's the tool set so you can move into configuration and you don't have to just focus on putting everything together yourself. All right, and so what I like to tell people about is at the top of this, those are channels for you. So if you're not one of those companies providing those services, they're still aggregating really large audiences. You should be there. You need to be where your customers are. And so, having some presence there, I think is important. But you should think of it as a channel. You're never going to have complete control over it. Kind of like social media, for example, you don't have complete control, but you want to be there because some of your customers want to be there and interact with you. On the lower level, we talk about capabilities, and that's what you can do, what you can provide for your customers. And that is really where the biggest change is. And you think about this as like first party services. That's like the assistant, right, itself, it provides to users. And then they have second party, which is like music and other things that are part of the same company, but they're not part of the assistant group. Not as important for you, but you're third party, most of you on this call or in this conference today. And what they need to think about is that first party is their channel, right? So they're going through Alexa, they're going through Google Assistant, they're going through Bixby. But when you build your own custom voice assistant, you become first party. And that has really profound effects for you in terms of having that capability, because you can provide new services that you couldn't do before, plus the things you're already doing today, you can actually be better at. And I'll just close on this idea of voice diversion. So we had this idea of enhancing a product experience in 1999 and 2011, and then creating a new device to deliver an experience, right? And I want to point this thing out as we bring this up to a close, is that 1999 and 2011 were about a capability. It's about existing products and enhancing that. And then 2014 and beyond with these platforms, that's the channel thing. And really what's interesting here is that platform thing, allowing other people to reach your audience and that thing, and using voice as the hook. That's actually the anomaly in this stream. And in fact, if you think about it, it's more the capability side. And if you're building your own assistant, putting it into your microwave, or you're putting it into your mobile app, or your website, your smart TV, that's actually more consistent with how this space has evolved. People have used voice in this way for a long time. I do point out to people sometimes that Siri actually was an app first before it was the iPhone's capability. And then now we're starting to see people put new voice assistants, custom voice assistants in apps, kind of like where Siri started. And sometimes it's just an assistant, and sometimes it's a feature within a broader app. But if you think about 1998, when I was doing work with a lot of large companies, the imperative was to launch a website. In 2012, maybe launch an app, or at least they were considering that. Now it's launch an assistant. So I think about custom voice assistants as sort of the new apps of 10 years ago. It's important. It's what people are expecting of you from a consumer standpoint. You can learn a lot more about this at research.voicebot.ai. I really thank you for your time today. I hope you learned a lot. We covered a lot of ground. And we've got new reports coming up on this specifically around voice assistants, custom voice assistants, but we also have other things around the consumer products. So thanks so much for your time today. Reach out to me at Bret Kinsella on Twitter. I really look for an opportunity to engage with more people here. And thanks a lot. Shout out to Pete Erickson and the MoDev team about bringing us all together in this global online forum. I'm Bret Kinsella, founder and CEO of Voicebot.ai. I hope to see you out there. And until next time, may the Voicebots be with you.